All right, so part two in our kind of formal look at and walkthrough of Christianity. So as we were looking at last time, there's kind of an inseparability, of course, between Judaism and Christianity. What Jews call the Torah or the Tanakh, their holy scriptures. Orthodox Christians usually refer to those same scriptures, more or less, as the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, they see the various prophecies given there regarding the Messiah, this saving figure, this anointed figure coming from the Jewish tradition, as pointing towards the figure of Jesus Christ. And the second kind of grouping of Holy Scriptures for Christians is what Christians call the New Testament. And this is a collection of, well, we'll go through the kind of the details here. The kind of the heart of the New Testament are what we call the Gospels, the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospel, the word itself means something like good news, and in this we get the kind of the biography of Jesus, his birth, his life, his teaching, his baptism, his various healing acts, and then of course the centrality of his death at the hands of the Roman government and his subsequent resurrection, which is at the heart of Christian belief and at the heart of its meanings. So the four different Gospels written by tradition, the four Gospel writers here, all overlap to a significant degree, but all also have their distinctive take on the life and mission, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Also, the New Testament is a kind of a biography of the earliest, what we call apostles, kind of the messengers of the gospel of this good news as it starts to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. So it's a kind of a history of the developing church as it spreads from Jerusalem throughout the Roman Empire of the day. And then probably the bulk, well, I guess I couldn't say in terms of words and page numbers, but certainly a large part of the New Testament are the epistles, the letters of Paul, who we mentioned last time. So remember, Paul was not a disciple of Jesus. In fact, he began his early life as an enemy of this growing church, and then he has this miraculous conversion experience, and then he becomes kind of the missionary of Christianity. And it's really in the letters of Paul that the story of the Gospels becomes kind of doctrinal Christianity. So the Gospels are kind of the what. This is what Jesus did. This is what he taught. And then Paul's letters really are the ones that really say, well, okay, well then, what does it mean? What does that mean for an individual believer? What does it mean for this thing that we're starting to call the church? What does it mean as kind of how does one live this kind of thing out? And then, there's other letters, of course, as well. There's a number of letters from John, from Peter, and a handful of others as well. And then the end of the last book in the New Testament is the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book, which is on the surface of it, a very strange book filled with wild imagery and symbolism, traditionally associated with John, who was the youngest of Jesus' disciples, the so-called beloved disciple, and by tradition he's the one who also lives the longest, or at least is the last to die. And by tradition he's given this apocalyptic vision regarding the return. Now, a little bit on the some kind of different factions or sects of Christianity. Eastern Orthodoxy is the so-called Eastern Church, or sometimes called the Greek Orthodox Church, which is one of the kind of the segments of Christianity that splits off fairly early from what we might call the Roman Catholic Church. Orthodoxy, the word literally means ortho, straight, right, correct. Doxos, doxy, teaching, right teaching, and that there's a lot of kind of complicated things going on at the root of this split, but there was lots of disagreement fairly early on kind of what proper Christian teaching was during the growth of the Christian church, and beliefs that there were lots of false teachings. There were very many divisions amongst the early Christians, and this leads to different factions. And so Eastern Orthodox Christians believed that these kinds of false teachings were an enemy of kind of the core true identity and purity of the church, and that they themselves were the protectors and guarders of the true teachings of the church, and provided kind of a wall against false teachings and further splits. As you know, in terms of its practice, it certainly at a glance would look a lot like, to an outsider, looks a lot like Roman Catholicism. A focus on the saints, holy individuals that can stand as intercessors, those who can kind of pray, bless you on your behalf with God, the practice of the Eucharist, the communion rite, confession of sins, the centrality of baptism, but the split centered around lots of kind of leadership issues, and kind of specific details on the persons of the Trinity, and what is to be held kind of sacredly at the center, and what's more peripheral. So yeah, you see here's a famous Eastern Orthodox church in Russia. This is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, which is distinct by its kind of its onion-shaped domes. You'll also see this is a priest in an Eastern or Greek Orthodox church ritual. Lots of smells and bells, as they called them. Lots of burning of incense. Lots of high formal ritual, and again in a way that's very similar to kind of a high traditional mass in Roman Catholicism. Now, what I would call kind of the real major split in the Christian church comes with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, in the 1500s. And this was spearheaded by Martin Luther, the guy that you see in the drawing back here, and who recognized him. He began his religious career as a monk, and he was going to enter into the priesthood, and he goes to Rome, and he is shocked and he's outraged by the corruption that he sees in the church, particularly kind of most famously the church kind of selling all kinds, ridiculous relics, and money going into the pockets of the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops, and most egregiously the selling of what they call the indulgences, where worshippers would pay money and receive a slip of paper which guaranteed that they would lessen their years in purgatory and hasten their soul to heaven. And of course, it was complete corruption, complete nonsense. It was simply designed to take advantage of the faithful, of the gullible, and of course, there's nothing biblical about it. And Luther recognized this right away, and Luther really started to kind of turn back to Scripture. And again, this was at a time where the Bible, such as it was for a believer, was when you heard it, you heard it in Mass. You heard it very likely in the Latin language, which even by Luther's time had already more or less become a dead language. Latin is still the official language of the Catholic Church today, and you'll still, there are traditional Masses that are held in Latin. But for the vast majority of people going to Mass, they didn't understand Latin, and so and they kind of knew when to stand, when to kneel, when to take communion. But there was this huge distance between the worshiper and, you might call, the religion itself. And so Luther started to ask these very kind of common sense questions, like, why can't Christian believers read Scripture on their own? And why can't they read or hear it in their own language? Luther was a German, and so why not translate the Bible into German? And that's actually one of the radical things that he did. And so people didn't need to kind of this notion that like the priest or the Pope stands between you and God, and everything kind of goes through the machinery of the church for you to get to God. And Luther, reading the Bible, Luther was a very learned man. He could read Latin and Greek, and he says there's nothing in the Bible that says this. And so he thought this is ridiculous. This is corrupt. People should be able to approach God, pray to God directly on their own. And so out of this kind of this turmoil and this Reformation, you get figures like Luther and Calvin and Knox, who really start to challenge the power of the Catholic Church and their stranglehold on doctrine. And then little by little, it makes its way throughout Europe, and then ultimately kind of brought to America here in various forms. And of course, it settles very, very concretely right here in Western Michigan, of course, with its variety of Protestant churches in the area, but all across the country as well. One thing that you could that many people point to as kind of an aspect of Protestantism, is that in Protestant Christianity, more or less, they recognize only kind of two sacred kind of official sacraments: baptism and communion. And this is because these are the only two sacraments where in the Gospels Jesus commands his disciples to do this. So baptize people in my name, and to he consecrates the rite of communion at the Last Supper before his death. But all the other sacraments, which like the Catholics recognize, they too recognize baptism and the communion or Eucharist, but the confirmation, penance, reconciliation, the anointing of the sick, ordination of priests, marriage, they recognize these as kind of holy biblical sacraments, whereas Luther said, well, these are the only two that Jesus says to do. So why are we doing these other things? This is not to say these other things aren't important, but Luther was very much about what in the Latin phrase sola scriptura, only Scripture. That's where everything kind of begins and ends, and everything else must be recognized as something other. So in Protestant Catholicism, it's very stripped down. No saints. There's no idea that there's no kind of holy, sacred kind of divinity of saints. No rosary. No pope. This notion that there is nothing that should stand between the worshiper and God. And in Luther and in Calvin and Knox's and others' interpretations of the Bible, it says that the priesthood, or kind of a learned preacher, there's a place for that, but it's not this necessary be-all end-all that should kind of hold, that should stand between the worshiper and the being worshipped here. So here's a painting of Martin Luther, an absolutely kind of fundamental figure in really the history of the world. Here, this drawing commemorates when he famously nails his 95 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in Germany. His 95 complaints against the Catholic Church, and this sets off an absolute atom bomb in the culture and in Western history. So, to this day, there's lots of. This is not to say that Protestants are unified. Far from it. Like any large grouping in any religion, there's going to be squabblings about what's more important than other things, and so you just get kind of a short list of a number of churches that would fall broadly under that Protestant banner, and they all have their own kind of various stripes of more liberal, more conservative, more fundamentalist, more kind of metaphorical. Lots of rooms, even Mormons, which for many Orthodox Christians they would consider not to be Christian at all, but Mormons would consider themselves to be, or Latter-day Saints as they prefer to be called, under the banner of Protestantism. And of course the Reformed churches, Christian Reformed, Presbyterian, all those churches which can dominate the local landscape here, are all kind of stemming from the heritage of Luther. Another one, another offshoot, which kind of falls under the banner of Protestantism, but is really quite something different, is Anglicanism. The Anglican Church also begins right around the same time as the Protestant Reformation is spreading across Europe, in England. And it kind of rides that wave of Luther's protest, but it really kind of came out of, you see this guy in the backside, the kind of the large and in charge Henry VIII, who is probably most famous today for his many wives and how many of his wives he had beheaded. A very kind of violent and in many ways disagreeable person, and he spent a lot of his reign, as I have here, challenging the authority of the Pope, and kind of bristled against that. That ultimately, as part of the larger kingdom of Christendom, that he had to ultimately bend the knee to the Pope. He didn't like this, and the kind of the most famous one is that Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce from one of his many wives, and to do this legally you had to get the permission of the Pope, and the Pope said no, and this drove Henry VIII crazy. Now that's the most famous issue. It's just one of a number of issues. It's sometimes simplified, saying that he basically says, well, if you're not going to let me get a divorce, I'll break off and create my own church, in which it is legal to get a divorce. There's some broad truth to that. But it really stems from his many disagreements with the authority of the Pope that they break off and really start their own church. And this too spreads mainly by kind of English colonization. I mean, there was a time in which, of course, the English had colonies all over the world, and wherever they went, they kind of brought their Anglican church with them. And so to this day, they survive. It's not a huge denomination, but you find Anglicans in many places around the world. Again, they reject the Pope's authority, but it's at a glance, if you were to walk into an Anglican ceremony, it would strike you, again, if you just had a broad understanding of all this stuff, it would strike you as very, very Catholic. Still very formal, liturgical. They have bishops, and so lots of the same language and kind of hierarchical structure that you find in the Roman Catholic Church. You'll find a corollary amongst Anglicans. It's much more, you would say, politically much more progressive than kind of traditional Roman Catholicism. Anglicans will ordain women priests. So could we say Anglicanism is a kind of progressive Catholicism in some ways? The Book of Common Prayer, while certainly not kind of held up to be scripture, is kind of a guidepost, sacred book for Anglicans, but it's certainly not on the level of the Old and New Testament. But that's a book that's associated with this particular offshoot. And sometimes you hear about they're called Episcopal, and Episkopos is in Greek the word that was often translated we translate as a bishop. It means an overseer, someone who's watching out for the organization church. All right, now just to kind of, this is a whole complicated history that we just simply don't have time to get into. But where does all this stuff come from? Like this thing we call the New Testament. Who decides what's included in that? How does that story come to be? It doesn't simply just grow up out of the earth. What was the process? And so I think it's an interesting, but also a kind of a foundational story and kind of understanding the roots of Christianity. And I think it's worth walking through. And before we get there, a little kind of political history. Up until the 4th century, that is the 300s AD CE, Christianity, as it kind of spreads rapidly from over here in Jerusalem and through the missionary work of Paul and Peter and others, it starts to spread throughout Greece, what we would call Turkey, into Italy, across the coast of North Africa. It starts to spread fairly rapidly, but it was still, technically illegal. Under kind of most Roman emperors, or really all of them, but to varying degrees, because it was seen to be at root a kind of a treasonous religion. If you believed in the Christian God, that means you reject all the Roman gods, and if you're rejecting the Roman gods, you're really rejecting Rome. And certainly, by the time Christianity starts to spread, there had been spreading the kind of the cult of the emperors. That the Romans developed this practice that when emperors died, they'd become deified, they'd become gods, and it was incumbent upon Roman citizens to do their due and to worship the Roman emperors. Well, of course, Orthodox Christians, refused to do this, and this would from time to time kind of get them into hot water with various political leaders around the world, around the Roman world. By and large, it was rare when there was kind of a full-blown persecution, but it did happen. And when it did happen, it was brutal. And by the time we get into the 4th century here, this kind of heavier, kind of around the year 305, really the days of the Roman Empire are numbered. It had become kind of too large and unwieldy for one emperor really to kind of rule it in any kind of efficient manner. So this emperor Diocletian, who was actually a very fierce persecutor of Christians, he made this drastic, bold move of splitting the Roman Empire in two. You had a western half and you had an eastern half. And the kind of the idea was that kind of each side would have an emperor, and they would have kind of a vice president, Caesar, that would help kind of organize and run this unwieldy, massive geography and population. And another thing to note here is that by this time, Rome itself had really become kind of a backwater. It was no longer the center of power and hadn't been for quite some time. And the money and the culture and the influence is all heading this way. It's heading east. And in particular this area, which we call Byzantium, which is later known as Constantinople, which we know as Istanbul today, this becomes kind of the seat of culture, power, and wealth. So, but it's also a time of fragmentation. The Roman Empire is barely holding it together. Well, into that kind of political chaos comes this figure Constantine. So when Diocletian dies, the whole process for succession, who's going to can step into the role of rulers, it falls apart, and it becomes, as had happened really for the last couple hundred years, is an emperor dies, and then there's a bunch of people that want to vie for the throne, and they all have their own private armies, and they start fighting each other. It was just a brutal, chaotic, bloody time, and this time is no different. And this figure Constantine, which you see in this very kind of almost over-the-top sanctified painting of him, Constantine, who was at this time a good pagan Roman, worshipped the gods. He comes from one of these kind of powerful families, military families, quasi-royal families, and he steps up and he says, "I want to take the throne," and it ultimately leads him into open conflict with the guy that you see down here, Maxentius, and they have this famous standoff at this bridge over the Tiber River, which sits just north of Rome, still there today, in the year 312. And I'm not a big person on kind of like interpreting history, that the idea that history turns on the minute decisions of great figures, of men and women throughout the era. My sense of kind of the progress of history is a much more multi-dimensional, complex, slow-moving kind of thing. But there are moments that matter. There are people that absolutely matters, and if I had to point to one of the turning points in the trajectory of Western history, it's this would be in my top 10, absolutely. And so the story goes is that Constantine is gathering his army on one side of the river. Maxentius is on the other side of the bridge, and Constantine has a vision or a dream, and in that dream he sees a sign of a symbol of the Christian God. We don't know exactly what he saw or what he claimed to saw, but it was some symbol of Christianity, which again, remember at this time was still an illegal, kind of underground, marginal religion. And he either hears or he sees the words along with the symbol that says, "In this sign you will conquer, you will win." And he takes his vision very seriously. And so what he does is he has this symbol painted on all of his men's shields and on their standards. Here it's represented by the cross, but the cross at this time it was not yet a central Christian symbol. And basically making a bargain with his deity. He says, "Okay, I'll take you at your word. If I win this battle, I will dedicate my reign to you." And they go out soon after that into battle, and it's a rout. Constantine's forces overwhelm Maxentius' forces. Maxentius himself is driven into the Tiber River, where he actually drowns, dies there, and thereafter Constantine dedicates his reign to the Christian God. Now, there's a lot of debate of whether Constantine himself was actually a believing Christian. We don't really know, but one of the first things that he does is that he legalizes Christianity, and so Christians are allowed to kind of come out of the shadows. It's no longer illegal to be a Christian, and this is again starts really. This is square one for kind of the building of the Catholic Church in Rome and throughout the Roman Empire, to becoming kind of the institution of the late Roman Empire throughout the medieval era into the Renaissance era and beyond. But Constantine also kind of gets involved in some of these doctrinal issues. And so once kind of the Christians are allowed to come out of the shadows, they can kind of more openly disagree with each other about what Orthodox Christianity really is. And so Constantine, again, we don't really know what he believed. We know that he waited to become baptized until he was on his deathbed. Some people interpret that Constantine knew that living a life of an emperor would mean that he'd have to, not to mince words, kill a lot of people. And so he saves the sacrament, the cleansing sacrament of baptism, until he's ready to die. But we do know that he was deeply interested in these disagreements and these kind of doctrinal disputes. And so he calls this famous council of Nicaea here, where he says, okay, we're going to settle some of these matters here. And the main issue at hand during this council, the main disagreement or heresy, as it's referred to, was what we call the Arianism. And it's named after this early church official Arius, who was teaching that Jesus was not fully divine. and remember, as we covered last time, Orthodox Christian belief says that Jesus, as the quote-unquote Son of God, is the mystery about him is a fully human but also fully divine. And he claims that Jesus is not fully divine, who had not always existed eternally, but rather was a kind of a later creation. Well, this was lots of other bishops said no. We need to stop this. We need to settle this. So he's declared a heretic, and this is before the council. Moves to Palestine, keeps teaching his ideas here, and so it becomes such a big deal that it gets Constantine's attention. So he calls this council and says, "We're going to settle this matter." And so we need to decide what's doctrinal, what's the correct belief, and what's kind of outside a correct belief. And so again, there's still debate here. Was Constantine really interested in this as a kind of a spiritual matter, or did he see, well, this could get out of hand and boil over into a kind of a political revolution, and I just want to settle that for the sake of keeping the peace? So he calls together all of these bishops who are now free to be out in the open, and brings them to Nicaea in the year 325 to settle this issue and others once and for all. So here's Nicaea, again, on the north part of what we would call Turkey today. Again, all this area here, everything's moving away from Rome. Even though Rome, as the site of the martyrdom where Peter and Paul were killed, it becomes, the Vatican is right, inside Rome here. St. Peter's Church purports to be over the grave of St. Peter. Rome becomes the heart of the Catholic Church, but in terms of where the culture was and all the power and the money was, it was still way over here at the time. So the bishops come together, and there are these three views. Kind of the question at the hand is, well, how do we understand? It really gets to the heart of what do we mean by the Trinity? How can three be one? How do we understand that in seeming mystical paradox? And there were kind of three different views. Arius' view was, Christ is outside of that. We should understand him as a different kind of divinely inspired substance, separate from God the Father, a view called heterousios, literally mean of different being, literally in Greek. And then Athanasius brought a kind of another idea into this. This is Christ to be understood as being of the same substance as of God the Father. No, fully divine, fully united, different but also the same at the same time. And then Eusebius said Christ understood as being similar substance as the God the Father. So you have these three Greek words: heterousios, different substance; homoousios, same substance; homoiousios, similar substance. And this is what they had to kind of nail down. So what was Constantine's role in this? And so some believe that he kind of pushed that second view, homoousios, which is the Orthodox Christian view. Christ is of the same being, substance as the Father. And so that Constantine came in and kind of pushed that understanding. And because Constantine believed that was the right way, the right doctrinal interpretation. Others believe that his interest in this whole thing was purely political. He just wanted unity. He just wanted some kind of agreement, something down on paper that would, keep the peace. And so, ultimately, it's the homoousios argument, the same substance that is ratified in the so-called Nicene Creed, which is an early statement of unified belief for early Christians. But throughout Constantine's own beliefs, his relationship to the church is tricky. Christianity did not become kind of the official religion of the Roman Empire until 380 CE AD, after Constantine's reign and death. And we know that Constantine early on, even after he had kind of legalized Christianity, he had won this victory in the name of this Christian God, he still allowed pagan temples to be built, pagan ceremonies to be built, the gods and goddesses of Rome to be worshipped and sacrificed to, and he kind of used money from the public purse to do this. So that raised that question: is what is he up to? Is he just being a good politician? Is this reflective that he wasn't really a believing Christian? It's difficult to say. So, for example, here's a coin that was issued during his reign here, which shows the face of Constantine on one side. You can see Constantinus. Here you see his name, and on the back you have a depiction of Helios, or Sol, the sun god. And this is well into Constantine's reign, well into the legalization of Christianity. So the question is, well, what is he up to here? What does Constantine himself believe? So some would say, well, yes, he was a Christian, but he also recognized that if he completely just turned all the spigots off for pagan Christianities, most Romans at this time were still believers in the traditional gods. If Constantine just came and said, that's all over, and now we're going to do this new god, he recognized that that would have led to chaos. And so he was just a good politician, while he may have been a believing Christian in and of himself. So there's no question that he was a canny politician. And so, for example, and this is the last slide I'll leave you with here, is after he won this victory with against Maxentius, and where he's this famous story where he sees the symbol of the Christian God, or hears the voice of the Christian God, and wins the victory with the power of the Christian God. One of the things that he did is, in Rome, he raised up this arch, this triumphal arch, to kind of commemorate his victory. And it's still here. It's still there in Rome. It's right next to the Colosseum today. And in the upper reaches of an arch, kind of the emperor was expected to kind of put an inscription. Who is the arch dedicated to? Why is it here? Kind of justifying the building of this monument. And here he talks about how he freed the empire from the evil power of the tyrant. You can see the word tyranno here, but he doesn't mention the Christian God. The only subtle reference he makes to that symbolic the power of the Christian God being behind his victory, he uses this phrase in Latin: instinctu divinitatis. He says he was inspired by the instinctu, by the impulse of the divine. That's how he did it. He doesn't mention, by the power of Jesus or by the power of the Christian God. By tradition, he knew exactly who this God was that had sent him the vision. But when he advertises it to the Roman people, he's very political. He says, no, I was just inspired by the divine to do this. So again, the question is, what does this mean? Does that mean that was the whole connection of the vision with Christianity, was that a myth that developed? Or again, is this Constantine just being a good politician and knowing that if he raised up this arch and he was advertising his debt to this Christian God, he would have made more enemies than he needed at that time. All right, that's all I got for you. I'll see you next time.